Speaker.
The Honourable Phil Goff.
Mr. Speaker, that would have been one of the sleepiest deliveries of any introductory speech that I've heard during my entire time in the House. And I know that we're under urgency and we've been meeting since 9 o'clock this morning and it's 10:15 and probably past the Minister's bedtime, but I thought he could have put a little bit more enthusiasm in the speech than that. Mr. Speaker, this is a bill that is supported by the Labor Party. In fact, it has been requested and supported by Auckland City, and this party is certainly supportive of Auckland City and the desire to make that a great city. Mr. Speaker, I hope that this bill is a sign of a change of heart by the government, a new readiness to cooperate with Auckland City in the future, because in the past it has seemed that that has not always been the case. In fact, Auckland City and the central government often seem to have been working down different paths. And, I think, I'm sorry that the Minister who's in charge of the bill isn't here to say this to directly, but, I regret that some of the time when the Minister makes comments about problems that Auckland faces, he is scapegoating Auckland as the cause of the very problems that his central government refuses to address. So I hope that this bill, working to implement something that Auckland City wants, is a sign of a better future in the relationship between central government and Auckland City. And I hope that the Minister realises, coming as he does from a smaller town, that with 36% of the population of the country and 36% of the production of the country, for New Zealand to succeed, Auckland has to succeed. And for Auckland to succeed, we need a decent unitary plan, and that's what this bill is designed to help facilitate. Actually, Mr. Speaker, the bill does two things. First of all, it corrects mistakes in the Principal Act, the Local Government Auckland Transitional Provisions Act of 2010, and I'll get to those errors because we've had a couple of days in urgency where all this House seems to be doing is correcting mistakes made by a government that has been hasty and has ill-considered the legislation before it. And, urgency is never a good way to correct mistakes, because when you force a bill through under urgency in the middle of the night when the Minister is barely awake and you don't send it to a select committee, you don't get a chance for the public to have scrutiny into the legislation, nor the committee to have scrutiny, nor the experts that could have corrected the mistakes that lead to us doing this now under urgency. It's a vicious cycle, Mr. Speaker, but the government never seems to learn from its mistakes. So the first thing this bill does, and I'll come back to it later, is to correct errors that were made in the Principal Act. And because those errors need to be corrected, we are from the opposition and we are here to help the government. The second thing, and the most important thing that this legislation does, Mr. Speaker, is to facilitate the processing of submissions on the draft Auckland Unitary Plan. Now, this plan is the most complex and far-reaching of any plan that has been considered probably in the history of this country. It's incredibly important. The Unitary Plan brings in 13 different district and regional plans, and it brings it together into one. And it means that we will have a resource planning mechanism for Auckland that is less complex, less fragmented, and hopefully better able to facilitate sound development, sustainable development, and housing affordability in Auckland. Now, towards the end of my speech, I want to focus on housing affordability because the Minister, in his comments about this bill, has emphasised that this is a way to help address Auckland's housing crisis. Well, it may, sir, but it won't come anywhere near the need to address the level of crisis in Auckland's housing, where house prices are now on average over $900,000, where they've gone up in a year by $180,000, where rents are increasing 3 to 4 times the rate of overall inflation, and where home ownership has dropped to the lowest level in 64 years. So while the Minister might be optimistic that the unitary plan can address all of this, I've got news for the Minister. He's going to have to do a whole lot more than this, and he needs to do a whole lot better than this in order to address that problem. The unitary plan is one aspect of the solution for Auckland's crisis, but it is only one aspect, and a lot more needs to be done. So what the Principal Act did was, instead of relying on the Resource Management Act to bring together these 13 different plans, that would have taken a decade, it brought in a streamlined process whereby the unitary plan could be notified, submissions could be heard on it by an independent hearing panel, and then that panel will report back to the Council. And a statutory deadline for that report back to the Council with recommendations has been set. It's the 22nd of July 2016, and with a huge amount of work still to be done. They've heard thousands of submissions, but they have another 5,000 submissions to be heard on site-specific issues. There was a real risk that this unitary plan was not going to be completed by the statutory deadline, wouldn't be considered by the Council before the Council elections in October next year, and as the Minister said, they wouldn't have the new unitary plan in place at the time that the special housing areas legislation is due to expire. Now, I'm not quite sure why the Minister should be worried about the impact of the special housing areas being due to expire, because the Minister set a target for Auckland of 39,000 extra houses. Doesn't that sound good? 39,000 extra houses for Auckland over 3 years. Probably won't, even if they achieved that, probably wouldn't resolve the imbalance of supply and demand, but it would go some way towards it. But the special housing areas that the Minister is so worried about the legislation expiring for was due to facilitate that. And what did it do? Well, here's the business section of the New Zealand Herald. You know, 2 out of the 3 years now having passed towards the goal of 39,000 houses, how many houses have been built in the special housing areas? Let's have some bids. How many houses out of the 39,000 that were needed by Auckland have been completed? 10,000? Do I hear something a bit better than that? That's very optimistic from Phil Twyford. 5,000. He's halved it, but he's still not there. Nowhere near there. You know, Mr. Speaker, how many houses have been completed in the special housing areas? No, you don't know. Well, let me tell you, sir. It's 102. 102 whole houses completed under the special housing area legislation. But the Minister says we've got to rush this legislation through under urgency for fear that the special housing legislation expires. Well, you know, I welcome 102 houses, but 102 houses when the goal was set by the Minister himself of 39,000 extra houses, it's not good, Mr. Speaker. And while I've made a little bit light of it, it is a serious problem. It is a serious problem because Aucklanders no longer can achieve the Kiwi dream of owning their own home. Aucklanders can barely afford to rent their homes. In fact, the government is spending $2 billion a year in subsidising rentals because people can't afford to make their rental payments. $2 billion a year, and a lot of that is going into Auckland. So let's come back to the question of the independent hearing panel and how this government is trying to facilitate it getting through the workload it has in front of it. And it does it by 3 mechanisms, Mr. Speaker, and we're in favour of this. It reduces the quorum for hearing sessions from 3 to 2 members. Now that might have a marginal impact in terms of the quality of the input, but I think the impact would be just that, marginal. I think 2 members can cope with that, particularly on the very specific nature of the issues that they'll be hearing from January next year. Secondly, it allows an increase in the possible number of appointed hearings panel members from 7 to 10. And that's a good thing, because there'll be more people available to serve on the panels. And thirdly, Mr Speaker, it enables the hearings panel to make its recommendations in stages rather than in one final report. So it will make its recommendations after each point is reached in the hearings rather than as one. So we support those three measures. We support the measures to correct the mistakes of the past, but we are utterly disparaging of the Minister's claim that even if we get this unitary plan right, and I hope we do, that is going to solve the massive housing crisis of availability and affordability in New Zealand. It will barely touch on that. Much more needs to be done.
Mr Speaker.